Hey, how's it going? In today's video, we're going to interview master amp builder Eddie Wang of Eddie Wang Instruments. This is a longer video, but I ask that you stick with it because there's some really cool stuff in here. We talk about how Eddie got started, both building guitars and amps and playing music himself. And we get into a slew of other topics that I found really fun and entertaining, and maybe some controversial opinions in there. Eddie and I met at the NAMM show a couple years back, and I'm so excited to be working with him and to get one of his amps here in the studio real soon. There'll be links down in the description below where you can find more information about Eddie's amps. Without further ado, let's get into the interview. It's good to see you again.
Yeah. Are you heading out to... Same here. It's been a while since... Actually, it's been that long, huh? Because the next NAMM show is coming up. Well, not coming up, but
yeah,
seems like it's coming up sooner than it should be.
Yeah, because it's being moved back to January, right?
Right. Are you going?
Yeah, that's the plan. I'm trying to decide if I want to play. But yeah, the plan is to be there. Totally what all the capacities that looks like, I don't know yet, but definitely it's in the calendar to be there. So
Nice.
Are you going to be there?
Yep, with Rainer as well.
Yeah,
Rainer. Yeah, he's we're sharing a booth again. You know, it's
awesome.
The way to do it.
Yep.
And you know, it works out great because I like his stuff. He likes my stuff. You know, when I leave the booth, he can talk about my stuff, and when he leaves the booth, I can talk about his stuff. And we got guitars and amps. That's all you need, right?
Yeah, man. I've said it before, but y'all's is my favorite booth in all of NAMM.
Thank you.
I want to kind of get into, like how you got started, and something I love to ask everybody, especially like when I talk to Rainer and a couple other builders, is like, where did you start playing guitar? Like when did that kind of enter your life?
Oh, wow.
And how did it slightly take over?
Wow, that's a loaded question. It's going to be a long one. Well, I kind of always grew up in a kind of a musical family. My mom was like a singer. And so, you know, it was always ingrained, like you have to play an instrument, you know, it doesn't matter, you pick whatever. But well, actually, no, they picked. First it was piano. I didn't really get along with that well, but I think it was great as a foundation, you know, because it's just so linear. And then I didn't want to keep doing that. So right around 8 or 9, I think, there's like, okay, why don't we try the cello? So I play cello since then. And I remember always being interested in guitar. So I tried guitar lessons when I was 10. And it was like, I didn't have a guitar. So the teacher just gave me this thing off the wall, which was like this plywood. The strings are like, who knows, like 16 gauge, you know, for a little kid, like a little 10-year-old, right? And the action's about 3 inches high. And it sounds like crap. And I remember plowing through it for a year, like in lessons. And it was just like, I hate this thing. I couldn't play. I can't make a good sound. So I stuck with the cello. So I gave it up. You know, I was playing in cello, like orchestras and quartets and just solo and all that stuff. And then at some point I was just, you know, I think a lot of, I hear this commonly with a lot of musicians kind of grew up in the classical world. You kind of like need an outlet for your not regimented side, you know, something that's kind of unique to yourself or whatever.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was 16, I was just like, I'm going to give guitar another try. So I saved up some money and I bought like this cheapo Fender acoustic, and just taught myself. And I think it was like one of those things where I had one side of my world, which was like playing cello, which is, you know, a lot of sheet music, playing orchestras, very strict, you know, and then I had my guitar world, which I almost was like rebelled against that world, which is basically I didn't want any lessons. I don't want to read any sheet music or learn any theory. I mean, I already knew theory because of classical music, but
Right.
But I was just like, I'm just going to make up my own path. And and that's how I kind of picked up guitar. And like I remember, it was the opposite of how I learned the cello. It was I would play songs on the radio on repeat. I would record it on tape because back then we used this thing called a magnetic strip that was around these two reels, and you put it in. It's called a cassette deck, right? And the cool thing about that, unlike CDs and stuff, is you can record. And so I would record these tunes off the radio and then just play it over and over and over again. Everyone within a 100-foot radius of me hated me. And I would just kind of learn tunes. And I remember, um, learning the first chords and how awesome that was. And yeah, and so that's kind of how I started. So guitar was always that kind of the rebellious side of me, where it's just I didn't want to play other people's music, except I did. So it kind of came around.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it was just a lot more expressive. I think that's part of the thing with the guitar is like it's hard to even like know 0 people that play guitar. I mean, obviously, like,
Yeah.
we're in this world, so we're surrounded with it, but, there's just so many people have played guitar at some point in their life, and unfortunately, I think with the cello, there's less people that find that, you know, freedom of expression, with the
Hmm.
instrument. I don't think it's, that it's not possible by any means, but I think it's just less common. But also, I
Yeah.
mean, like, I'm a little bit jealous of that because that gave you like some foundation, some of that fundamental that it's hard to learn afterwards.
Yeah.
For sure. As I've taught people, it's, trying to apply some of that fundamentals after the fact is definitely a little bit harder. But okay, so you started playing guitar. At what point did you start building them? Because I noticed it's Eddie Wang instruments,
Yeah.
and there's some guitars and stuff on your website that are kind of this really, I mean, they're really beautiful, and they're like kind of blending between Fender and Gibson in that
Oh, thanks.
25-inch scale length and, some set neck where you might not expect it. So at what point did like it go from you picked up, you bought that cheapo acoustic or whatever to like, okay, I'm gonna tackle my first instrument?
That Yeah, so I think there's like kind of two legs to the story. So one was like I was always someone, even since I was like a little wee bitty kid, like to take apart things and figure out how they worked. And I remember when I was like 5 or 6, I like took my mom's, I think it was a fake Rolex, it's one of those, but it was like a really nice watch. And I remember unscrewing it and figuring out how to unscrew it because we didn't have screws that little back then. So I figured out how to unscrew it and took it apart, because I needed to know how those little things worked, right? Why does it keep moving? Is it, it's not magic. It's some kind of technology or whatever, right? So I took it apart and I was like, whoa, this is pretty neat. It's little fine little pieces. And I remember trying to put it back together and it didn't work. It felt so bad. But my parents never punished me for that because they knew this. They didn't want to hamper my curiosity. So ever since I was little, I always had to take things apart and figure out how they worked. And that's kind of like how I started building amps, which was, I couldn't really afford the nice stuff, but I wanted the nice stuff. So I just found a used copy of a vintage amp and took it apart, and it was just like, I can build this myself. And I think that kind of bled over in the guitar world too, where yeah, I do make guitars. I don't try to advertise it because I mostly just kind of make it on the side when I have some free time. But it's that same vibe where like, I grew up in like the classical world and guitar was like my rebellious side. I wanted to not conform, to be different. And the reason I started building my guitars is because I couldn't really find what I wanted out there that didn't cost, like $7,000.
Yeah.
Like I like I like both Fender and Gibson sounds, those are the standards, but I didn't want to have a guitar that sounded like a Fender or have a guitar that just sounded like a Gibson. I wanted not necessarily something that can do both, but just kind of it's a unique thing.
Yeah.
And so the easiest way to do that was just kind of make it myself. So I just kind of figured out how they made it. I talked to a lot of luthiers and kind of, was always very observant about what they did and how they did things. sometimes YouTube videos. YouTube is like a game changer in this world, I
Oh
think.
man. Yeah.
uh, um, yeah, and then that's kind of how it got started. And then a lot of mess ups, and I sold those for really cheap on Craigslist. Um, and yeah, that's kind of the story. And then oh yeah, speaking of which, I do have one up there. That's like the orange one right there. I don't know if you can see it. That was like the first one I ever made,
Oh wow.
and I don't sell that one because it's um sentimental.
Yeah.
Now I remember going to the wood store and just like every piece of wood I would just like knock on and listen to. It has to have the right resonance.
Yeah.
And everyone looked at me like I was crazy because I spent like an hour just knocking on different pieces of of mahogany and different pieces of maple, and that's where the woods from that come from. And I kind of take that to like all my instruments. I always like hand pick all the woods, because
Yeah.
to me it makes a difference, and not everyone agrees, but screw them.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's there's something about that, like just connecting with a piece of wood, kind of envisioning what it's going to be. Um, I there's something about that. I also think there's something to, and I think that that might be why I feel like a friendship connection with you is this like-minded. I have this like it's not an ability, it's like I have to understand how things work.
Yeah.
And that probably has some deeper psychological, roots that are both, have good and bad outcomes. But,
Right.
you
The
know,
control
r
freak need.
yeah, exactly. I mean, for better or worse, but like, yeah, my
Right.
first guitar, I had to take it apart
Oh, nice.
just to know what it was. I didn't even know what I was doing, and almost just to see, like, can I put this back together? And I mean, that was like I took things apart all the time. I haven't walked into my wife always makes fun of me because like we'll be sitting at dinner and she's like, "What are you trying to figure out?" And I'm looking at like how they interestingly hung these air ducts and like but it's this like need and desire to understand how things function, and that's like the most joyful thing of my existence, it feels like. And so that's what led me into kind of guitar repair and this like obsession with gears. I just want to know how things
Nice.
work and how people come to make the decisions that they make.
Yeah.
And I think that's the human part of it, is that we all have these preferences that then inform us in different ways to make decisions. And the people like you who make instruments and tools for art, but they're pieces of art themselves, and they're also highly functional, is like this combination of all these micro decisions that were informed. So, and that's really cool that you kind of hold on to the first guitar that you made.
Yeah. Thanks.
The photos of the ones on the website are gorgeous, and
Oh, thank
so
you.
but okay, so you talked a little bit about how that kind of came into you building your own amps, and they're under the wattage control because you have this unique wattage control feature. There's this kind of story. So tell me a little bit about the like having to turn down to three experience and how
Oh,
that led
yeah.
you to building amps and then including that feature in all your designs.
Nice. Well, good memory. Thanks. Yeah, when I was fresh out of school, I remember, I was trying to, college, make it, still trying to make it as a musician. And I was, gigging and doing things. I lived in London for a year where I had like a little Tweed Deluxe in one hand and a Strat in the other hand and a couple pedals in my backpack, and schlepping around in the underground, and the importance of a lightweight amp was really ingrained in me.
Yeah.
um and all these things, like I like what you said before, the kind of little micro decisions, all these little things kind of uh swirl around in your brain for years, and they gestate. And one of the things I remember was, I love the, as most guitars, I think, love the tone of an amp just kind of on the verge of breakup, just kind of cranked and ready to explode, especially a Tweed Deluxe. It's a thing of ugly beautiness or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
It's uncontrollable ugliness, but there's some kind of coolness to it. Um, and that's how I got my overdrive tone from the early days. And uh, I remember there was like a distinct period where suddenly everyone was miking amps up anyways, but I remember there was like a moment within like a year or two where everyone was trying to reduce stage volume. And the audio, the sound engineers were suddenly just like, "You gotta turn that down. You gotta turn that down." And that was exactly the one experience I had where I was playing a gig, and I usually set my Tweed Deluxe at 6, right? And it was just too loud, so like I had to turn it down to 5. It's like, no, it's still too loud. It was being yelled. You don't want to piss off the sound engineer,
Yeah.
especially if you're like a band that has no name. And so I turned it finally. It was like 4.5. Is that good? And I was like, no. And then 3, and it was finally 3. It was like, okay, fine, it was doable. And I was just like, yeah, I had a Fender Strat, and I remember just trying to get that crank, and I was like pounding the thing as hard as I can just to kind of get a little bit of distortion. And it was really frustrating. And when I like bought a Klon. And back in those days, right, you actually had to like call on the phone. I remember calling Bill and was like, "Hey, how do I order one of these?" And I mailed him a check. Those are these things where you put them in these little paper things, and you lick it and seal it, and you put a stamp on it. Um, this is the olden days. And you mail it, and then like 3 weeks, I got this like thing in the mail, and I opened it. It was a Klon. Don't worry, I don't have it anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I played through an overdrive pedal for a long time, and I hated it. It wasn't bad. The Klon was a great overdrive pedal, but it's not the same when you're used to cranking amps.
Yeah.
Some of the most iconic guitar tones that we have in our brains were from cranked amps, right? Not
Yeah.
a couple maybe from overdrive pedals, but most of them were from cranked amps. Um, and there's
Especially
also
that
that,
Tweed Deluxe. I mean, that's a crank that thing and put you know,
yeah,
Royer 121 on it, and that is a sound. I mean, that's the
yes.
sound of records.
And my other favorite amp was the AC30, which I never was able to crank. And I love the sound of an AC30 just about to blow up.
Yeah.
And those things were ear-splittingly loud. So that's kind of where the idea of the wattage control came in. And I already had started building my own amps, and I was at a point where I was just like, I need to make these things usable. I'm not really into copying other people's work. And I looked in various, and I was always a tweaker, so I started building, like power scaling, variable voltage stuff. There's all things. I tried all the attenuators, and I hated them with a passion. Um, Nothing wrong with attenuators if they work for you. They just don't work for me. I don't really like the way they feel. They always feel disconnected to me. And, electronically that makes sense, as you open them and try to figure out what's going on. The speakers aren't seeing the same load as they would, connected directly to your tubes. So, or transformer. So yeah, I tried it all. I even tried, what are they called? Yellow jackets, where you plug in those EL84s to make the tube smaller or whatever.
Yeah.
Where it was used to be like an EL34 or 6V6 or 6L6, whatever. And I tried it all, and was never really satisfied. So I started using power scaling a little bit, just tweaking my amps and trying these circuits out. And I felt like I was on the right track, where I was like, this could be something good, because it doesn't seem like it's killing the amp like the other methods did. Um, and then, yeah, just about maybe 5 to 7 years of just tweaking, and trying other people's circuits. I kind of landed on a circuit that really worked for me. And then another year or two of just being like, I need to make this simpler, because in my mind, simpler is more reliable, easier to fix if it does break. And so I spent another 2 years just kind of simplifying it. And it's kind of weird because when you look at the circuit, a few other people have come to the same kind of ended up on the same spot. Mine's a little bit different, but like other variable voltage circuits, there's a lot of similarities. Because tubes, there's only some way you can mess with them before
Right.
you turn it into a nuclear bomb. But uh, yeah, so it took about, I think, 7 years total, just kind of just tweaking and finally figuring out something that really works. And this latest design that I have in my current amps is kind of that sweet spot where you have simplicity, and I hesitate to call it electronic perfection, because there's ways to make it electronically perfect, um, but that would take a whole nother circuit board and all
Yeah.
these things. So this is a very simple circuit that does good enough job, super reliable, and it doesn't kill the feel. And that was the number one um, criteria, is that it had to retain the feel all the way down to the lowest wattage.
Yeah.
Um, and that and the way I do it in my amps is that it adjusts the internal voltages proportionally. So the tubes still think they're being driven hard. They don't know any better. But it doesn't cut the voltages where they shouldn't, like for example, like the heaters and stuff like that.
Right.
So it's still given its full supply of electrons that it wants. It just thinks it's being driven hard, and it's not. And then you have to balance one tube to the next. So each tube, when you turn it down, still pushes the next tube the same amount. Um,
Yeah.
and
So it's like you're not
yeah,
starving
yes,
those power
exactly.
tubes, because that's that feel thing is something that I really connect with your amps, is that feel. And like, even in craziness of NAM, but like you can there's a response there. And I feel like almost every power scaling option out there that I've played through is so sterile. Like it takes the feel
Uh,
and makes everything stiff, and you can feel that things are being starved. Like the gain staging isn't right. If
yeah.
you're thinking about a mix, and the same thing with like a effects loop. It's really hard to like predict exactly what's going to go in between there,
Yeah.
and if it's not built in, or if you're cutting out and jumping in at the wrong spot, you're starving things, and that
Yeah.
totally changes the response,
Yeah. Don't
you
get me
know?
started on effects loops.
Yeah. So that's really interesting that the journey kind of it's taken, and that makes sense that, you're equally adjusting the amount, that the power tubes are seeing, so that they're not being starved, so that you can retain that feel, all the way through. So, and as you've simplified that, I mean, you kind of were talking to me about, keeping the amp as linear, and streamlined as possible,
Hmm.
to kind of get more of, I don't know, just less processing. I mean, it's less actual
Yeah.
processing of the electrons and everything. But so talk me through, kind of where we've ended up with the lineup now with the Polaris, and how that amp kind of came to be. And then I want to talk about the Quantum Zen and the kind of modded version, that we
Oh
saw
yeah.
at NAM.
Yeah. Actually, it's the other way. I think the Quantum Zen came first, and then the
Okay.
Polaris, which is the one behind me. Actually, this is the
Okay.
one I think I'm sending to you.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. So there it is in all its glory. Came next out of a demand for like a larger amp. So I always subscribe to the mentality that the less there is between your guitar pickups, your strings on your guitar, and the speakers, the better. That doesn't necessarily mean less is better, because the reason we like tube amps is because they fuck with your signal.
Right.
Sorry, excuse the language.
No, yeah.
They This is hopefully not for little kids.
No.
They they screw up their signal. Is what we call distortion, right? Tubes are
Yeah.
not linear. They have weird behaviors. They throw electrons randomly, and some of them just hit random parts of the tube. It's a mess, but it's a glorious thing because if you ever plug like an electric guitar into like a hi-fi amp and like
Yeah.
where it like reproduces it exactly, it's like one of my most hated sounds in the world.
Yeah, it's tough.
Brittle, it's high, tingy, and annoying. So we need kind of those tubes to kind of warm it up. And the thing with the quantum, one of the things at NAM that one of my most hated questions is not necessarily the most hated question. It's when people are persistent about it that I hate it. Was when they ask me, what are these amps based on? And I
Yeah.
say, my answer is always like, no, these are like redesigned from the ground up. And they're like, no, no, you can't do that. What are they based on? And when they do that, that's I'm just like super annoyed. Because I did actually maybe a more accurate response would be what are they not based on? Because what I did was I took a lot of I a lot of amps and designs and figure out what went wrong or why do they not work well and not do that.
Yeah.
And then I also tune it to today's guitar players, because when the tweets came out, electric guitar was still a new thing
Yeah.
and they didn't really necessarily know what electric guitar. I mean, Fender was trying to make it as clean as possible, but guitarists were like, "No, we like it when it's dirty and breaking up." So it was
Right.
like this fight. So today's guitarists are not the same as back, 50, 60 years ago, or amps. And so what I did was I based these designs on trying to keep that cool vintage vibe and that simplicity, but tune it to fit what today's guitar players really need. So like the Quantum Zen, which is what came first, was kind of a it's been in my head for a decade or more. And then um Scott from Zen Guitar Trading approached me one day and he was like, I really like the EF86 sound. And it kind of like where all the stars align is like I've been tweaking this kind of one design. So one of the things about the Quantum Zen, and kind of goes into Polaris in just a sec, is that
Yeah.
if you love tube amps, which I assume you do, and probably people listening to this probably do as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that those iconic guitar tones that we all grew up on, right? Most of them came from power tube distortion. Like when you crank in, the power tubes are actually distorting, and um, there's there's a thing with power tubes when they distort because they're pentodes. Most of them are pentodes, so the American ones are tetras, but they're trying to be like a pentode, is that they have this natural compression that happens. And so in our the way we play it, it's like a sweeter, more musical tone versus
Mhm.
preamp distortion, which tends to be triodes. That means there's only three elements instead of five or four. They kind of blat out. So if you have like an amp with a lot of preamp distortion, it sounds like someone's saying blat like 120 times a second. Blat 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 blat.
Yeah.
It's a little nastier sound in my mind. I prefer the power tube distortion.
Yeah.
Um, and that like I grew up again. This goes back to my upbringing. I grew up playing cello and also most acoustic instruments. With the wood, when you push it to its limits, it gets harder and harder to push past. So even like a cello, violin, a acoustic guitar, they all have natural compression, which the louder you play it, once it hits its limit, it's harder to get it to vibrate a little further, right?
Mhm.
And as a musician, that's what we hear as musicality, as tone, as feel, or not tone, but as feel.
Yeah.
Um, it is pushing back on us a little bit, and so that's why I wanted in my amps. I wanted power tube like distortion and not that kind of trio preamp distortion that we hear in like triple rectified. I won't name the
Yeah.
brand. But I mean, it's a great sound. It's not as versatile as what I like to play.
Yeah.
And so that's where the EF86 comes in. The EF86 is a pentode. And so when it breaks up, at least when you tune it right, it does that kind of natural sweet compression where the notes sustain longer without necessarily getting more distorted,
Mhm.
like overdrive pedal, not distorted, like audio distortion. When we talk like electrically, but like
Yeah.
that kind of like blat blat blat, like 100 times a second. So it'll get sweeter and sustain longer, but still sound clean, ish, before it actually goes into that overdrive, what we usually associate with when people say distortion, they think overdrive.
Right.
Um, so that was a great opportunity. So sorry, backtracking a little bit. So yeah, so that with the EF86, the problem with the EF86, it gets a bad rap because everyone copies vintage designs. And this kind of goes back to where like when people ask me, what's this based on? I'm like, I can tell you what it's not based on. Um, for example, we know of EF86 from vintage Vox designs, and they quickly, I think Vox quickly try to get rid of that as soon as possible because of all the feedback issues and stuff. But
Oh
like,
man.
I think I may have read the history wrong, but from what I think is when they use the EF86 in the first preamp stage, they just basically looked at like RCA microphone manuals for how to make an EF86 circuit. I don't think they really tuned it to guitar. And having the first preamp stage is like a waste because the guitar signal is so little, it's never going to drive a tube and not enough to make it actually to get the cool characteristics out of it. So when I use the F86, I don't put it in the first preamp, I put it in the second preamp, and it's
Mm.
not gained out like they in the old vintage circuit. It's like a normal gain level. In the vintage circuits, it's like gain to the max because they're trying to get as much out of it as possible.
Right.
So I have it as a low gain setting in the second stage, and so that way the first preamp tube is the one that drives that one. So when you do crank it and overdrive it, the EF86 will start compressing a little bit and giving you that sweet pentode, kind of like a power tube distortion.
Right.
At the same time, the power tubes are also overdrive. So I balance it right. So like when the preamp starts overdriving, the power tubes start overdriving about this. It's not exactly the same amount, but this is what we like cascading distortion, right? When we
Yeah.
have the interactions between these two, and they're not quite the same, and one will push a little first, and then the next one, that we as guitar player or musicians love that because it's like the quirkiness of an instrument. The reason we like wood guitars and wood cellos is
Right.
because wood is like the most uneven, quirky material you can build with, right?
Yeah.
Every square inch of that piece of wood is different than the next square inch. It is it's got a lot of distortion in it, and so that's kind of where the quantum zen design came from, where I didn't want triode distortion. I wanted pentode distortion. I want a simple circuit. I want to make sure that it's tuned to the way guitarists play today. So like even the tone, if you look at like every Fender, Marshall, Vox, whatever, they all copied each other's like tone stack.
Yeah.
This tone stack is nothing like that. It has like the bass control comes early because that's where you can actually clean it up or dirty it up or whatever. The treble control comes later because if you put the treble too early and you cut the trebles, then you kill some of that harmonic buildup that
Yeah.
sweetens up the high end. Which that's one of the biggest criticisms I have with Fender amps. The reason, like, if you want to turn down the treble because it's piercingly annoying, you turn it down, you lose some of that kind of sweet harmonic top end. And I
Yeah.
never really liked that about Fender amps. So I want to make sure that didn't happen here. So I put the treble control somewhere else in the circuit where it doesn't have as much, it doesn't kill the harmonics as much. Yeah, and so that's kind of where the quantum zen came from. And the again, it's two EL84s, and most people associate EL84s with like British Vox amps, but the way this is tuned, it actually sounds kind of like a halfway between a 6V, what people normally associate with 6V6,
Yeah.
and EL84. So I think some artists have described it as like the best of both worlds, and it's because it's not tuned like a Vox. It's completely different. Like when people ask me what's this based on, it's not based. Maybe the output section has a little bit more similarities to a Tweed Deluxe than it does to a Vox. I'll
Yeah.
give away that much.
Oh,
But
well,
that's just
I think you said something, you kind of touched on something important there. And just to kind of drive this point home, there are clones of things. And for better or worse, guitar players, we are extremely resistant to change.
yeah,
And besides the fact that the power coming out of the walls isn't the same as it was in 1962, much less that amp from 1962 doesn't sound the same today as it did then.
Hmm.
But just because there's an EL84 power tube doesn't mean that, oh, well, then it's a Vox, because
Right.
specifically, I mean, tone stack location changes everything. I
Oh,
mean,
it's
like it,
huge.
and so, I think it's important that you're pointing this out as the designer, that like, no, you made decisions, and that is wildly different. There's only so many power tube options. Just because it's one
Right.
thing doesn't mean that it therefore implies that every EL84 is a Vox, and 6L6 is a Fender, because um I mean, it's not true. I think we know it's not true, but um sometimes it's hard to get those, preconceptions out of our mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say like a perfect example of that is like the what's it called? The Fender Blues Junior had EL84s in it.
Yep.
Sounds nothing like a Vox. Sounds like a Fender.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, that's the thing with tubes is like you can make tubes sound like other tubes. At least what we think in our mind. I can make an EL34 sound like a 6L6. At least according to what most guitarists think a 6L6 should sound like.
Yep.
One thing I do like about EL84s is that you can kind of make it sound like a 6v6. But when you really drive it, EL84s kind of have their own little thing that not many other tubes can get close to. It's kind of like that swelling richness. I don't know, at least according to my ears.
Yeah.
Versus a 6v6 kind of starts getting a little blatty, not in a bad way, but again, it comes down to the fact that EL84s are true pentodes versus 6v6 are what we call beam tetrodes, which is, if I get my history right, because when pentodes were invented, they were also patented by, I think, Mullard. And when the American companies wanted to make, power tubes like the EL34s, they couldn't do true pentodes. So they came up with a beam tetrode, which is you know, 4 elements instead of five, but
Right.
trying to mimic a pentode. Um, Again, I might have my history wrong, but at least that's
Yeah.
from
Well, I
my
mean,
understanding of whatever we read.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that and part of that is like, there's so much more to an amp than the sound of one specific part. And I think
Yes,
there's,
exactly.
having, I don't know, done a significant amount of repair work, I think so many people would be surprised at what a power tube is actually contributing to the sound.
Yeah,
Because I think that it's the combination of things. It's the sum of the parts that
exactly.
that create a specific sound, and somehow that's been condensed to the narrative of, well, that's what this tube sounds like. And I just don't think they'd sound the way that
Right.
there is, in for some reason, commonplace, that attributes of these. And the same thing with preamp tubes, like you're saying, with the EF86 being in V1, it can be so brittle in
Mhm.
V1, and the fact that you're driving it um, with a triode, uh, and then putting it in V2. I, Again, it's even going back to power amp tubes, actually clipping, actually creating some distortion, harmonic content, I think is the sound of recorded guitar. And then
Mm.
when people play in the room, few times are you playing guitar loud enough that you're just pushing the power amp tubes. And so therefore, like, maybe your experience with an EF86 or your experience with an EL84 is playing in like bedroom volumes,
Yeah,
and that's just a wildly different experience than turned up. And it's less about the sound pressure level, which plays a huge part as well. But I mean, things feel and sound different. because there's physical changes that are happening beyond the volume. But so the Quantum Zen at NAM, you had a different speaker and a 12A Y7
Yeah.
in V1. And I think you mentioned that that was kind of, it gave us a familiar feeling and sound to the Pulsar, the discontinued amp. So talk to me about that and just kind of
Yeah.
how that came to be.
Yeah. So the Quantum Zen is um, you know, to float my own boat a little bit, a fantastically simple amp. I worked really hard to kind of cut out as much stuff that's not needed or try to do the same thing with less parts. Um, and so is a really, really simple amp. I mean, it's really just two preamp tubes, two power tubes, right? And one rectifier. And so because it's a simple amp, every little change makes a huge difference. And I like how you said you described it as a sum of its parts, right? Like people can argue like, oh yeah, speakers make the biggest difference. Yeah, I agree. But you can't separate the speaker from the rest of the amp, right? You could change your speaker and whether you have a Celestion Blue or a P12N, um, yeah, that P12N will sound completely different than the Celestion Blue in the same amp, but it won't sound like that other amp, right? Um,
Right.
because the amp drives that speaker a little differently. Um, and same with transformers. So I would say like transformers make a huge difference, which is why I have like Brian Sauer's Sour Sound here. He tunes, he basically like knows how I think now. He's like, if he was a counselor or psychologist, he would have mapped my brain out already. So like he helped me tune the transformers for this because that the transformer makes a huge difference. And so the quantum sense, so I call it the red knob variant because I put red knobs on it to distinguish that this is different. It's actually literally it's the same amp. Everything's the same except for one speaker and one tube. And so what I do is the preamp tube instead of a 12AX7 is a 12AY7. Now the cool thing about the Quantum Zen, if I'm giving away all my secrets, I guess, that first preamp tube is not only the first gain stage, but it's also the phase inverter. So um, changing that one tube is almost like a completely different amp. It changes the entire kind of gain structure and balance of the amp. So the cool thing about 12AY7s is that it's a lower gain, so it's going to push the EF86 a little less. And that means that you're going to get more power amp distortion and less preamp distortion. And also the 12AY7 as a phase inverter swings a little bit more than the 12AX7. So it actually can push the
Hmm.
power tubes a little harder too. So not only do you get less preamp distortion, but you also are pushing the power tubes harder when you do crank it. Um, so it it completely shifts the distortion balance or the overdrive balance towards the power tubes. It's almost like near so that all the F86 is really doing is just adding a little bit kind of sweet natural compression, but staying pretty clean. And for me, that was the aha moment. I've always this is one of those things where I put a 12AX7 in there. I like it. It's my second favorite tube in there. Very close to 12AY7. I actually no, I should take that back. It's not a favorite or less favorite. It's just if I want something different,
Yeah.
right? It's like different, not necessarily better, just different. Um, but as guitarists, almost every 90% of preamp tubes out there are 12AX7s, and so we there's a familiarity. 12AX7s have a sound. There's this
Right.
kind of uh, ch- uh um a little bit more kind of a I don't know how to describe it, like a chimey texture in the mid range. Um, that's kind of unique to 12AX7s. And it's
Hmm.
part of the gain structure as well. Um, and we're used to hearing that because every amp has that. You listen to any record, it's 12AX7s everywhere. Um, so when you take that away, the immediate reaction is like, "Ooh, this is missing something." right? Like you feel like it's missing something, but no, it's not. It's just taking something away so that something else can kind of take over. It's kind
Right.
of like when you take away reverb. You know, if you ever play through reverb and then you just unplug the reverb or take away your reverb pedal or whatever, turn it off. At first, you feel empty inside,
Yeah.
like life doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
Right? But then when you get used to it, you realize, oh wow, there's something cool about having a pure, clean guitar tone that I can't really do. That reverb kind of hides, right? Um, in fact, I always tell people like, you know, when the moment you unplug a reverb, give yourself, 5-10 minutes to acclimate, because it's going to suck that first
Yeah.
5 minutes. Um, but after you do that, like I barely play with reverb anymore because there's so much more nuance that can be exposed when you don't have something just kind of washing over the button. And I feel the same way about 12AX7. I love the sound and everything, but there's a certain texture to it that when you take it away, the first reaction most people have is like, ooh, something's missing. I can't live with myself anymore, right? Um, and so when I plug a 12AY7, Tweet Deluxes have 12AY7, so it's not an unfamiliar sound. It's a little bit more rounded in the low end and maybe slightly more scooped. I wouldn't say scooped. It's just it has less that weird texture in the mid range,
Yeah.
and the high ends are a little rounder. Um, and it's because it's not pushing the preamp as much. It has a little bit more, and because of that, you can have a little bit more nuance in certain places that you can't quite get with the 12AX7. It's a different place that it emphasizes different things.
Yeah.
And for when I do that, I feel like I play differently. I come up with cool sounds and things like that. And right now, that's what I mainly play. Um, just because I don't know, maybe I just like to be different. But yeah, and then to kind of so it's a very different sound. I would say it pushes if you had to use our guitar's colloquialisms, right? I would say it sounds more tweed like because we associate tweeds with kind of that lower gain, more pushy type of sound. Pushy sounds a bad word. I can't think of a better word.
No, I
It's
yeah, I think pushy is kind of right. Yeah. I don't know of another it's hard. We come up with these
right.
ridiculous, adjectives to describe sound
Yeah.
and feel and things, but,
Well, I'm going to stick with pushy because it's one of the few times where the word pushy is actually a positive thing,
yeah,
or said in a positive way. So it's a good pushy. Uh, and then I want to accentuate even more that kind of like American-esque what people associate with Americans. So I played around with different types of speakers, and the one I came up with was the so WGS warehouse guitar speakers. Um, start introduce this new I forgot what it's called, the paper coil. It's a paper coil
yeah,
speaker instead of using I don't know what they use in other ones, but the other ones like plastic or fiberglass or something stiffer than
yeah,
paper. But because it's a paper coil, it's more prone to flexing. And I'm not talking about the cone. The cone's all paper.
right,
Um, and and I think this is how a lot of the old vintage speakers were made as well. It adds like a cool texture. Again, it's that feel thing where like, a guitar top, like wood because wood is defective, defective. Wood is not even. It has these weird distortion and it's irregular.
yeah,
It the paper coil does that similar thing to it. Where when it's vibrating hard, it has a little more flex to it, kind of adds a cool texture. And then they also came out, they put it on a smooth cone. So it's based on their G12, which is their like kind of American-ish speaker.
right,
And it's the I asked for a smooth cone and I wanted that paper coil and they had a model already like that. And I was like, awesome. Let me try.
yeah,
And the rep dropped it off like a whole stack of different speakers for me to try. And for some reason, this one was just like, I just, it just, when it paired with that, I was like, ooh, this is like magic. Um, and because it's paper coil, it's only 25 watts. So I don't put it in the Polaris because it would just blow through that thing.
yeah,
Um, I wish they could make a higher wattage version of it. But yeah, and so that speaker just kind of accentuates that unique quirkiness of the 12AY7, the way it's pushy, right? So pushy, and then you have something that's kind of textury but muffled.
Yeah.
Muffled's a bad word for it. Textured but round,
Yeah.
as a speaker, and pairing those together is just like kind of like, one of those magical musical pairings, right? Like putting a Les Paul and a Marshall or something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and it's what's awesome is that just those 2 changes, I mean, you've got just a different texture for the amp, it puts it in a different place. Um, I'm interested to know, just out of my own curiosity, if you tried, like, what other preamp tubes, how that affects the circuit, in that way, like an AT7. I actually don't know the differences between an AT7 and an AX7, but I'm just curious if there's other preamp tubes that might have taken a mod into a different direction.
Yeah, I think I tried them all. I tend to stay away from AT7s because they tend to sound really glassy in a bad way to me, stiff. AT7s have properties that are good for, like, say, driving a reverb transformer driver, but not necessarily good for, like, guitar. I don't.
Gotcha.
Um, so that was one of those. I'm just going to try it just for shits and giggles, and I plugged it
Right.
in and played one chord and pulled it right out. Um, uh, AU7 was okay. It was just sounding weird.
Yeah.
But the coolest thing I experimented with was actually different types of 12AX7s. And there's not as much variety for 12AY7s, but even the variety I did have made huge difference as well. So like,
Hmm.
I have as with a lot of amp builders, a okay collection of NOS tubes. And this is a weird, but I actually don't prefer NOS tubes. It's kind of, maybe I'm different in that way.
Hmm.
But I tried a bunch of NOS tubes. They all sounded different. I kind of landed on the JJ Goldpin 12AY7
Okay.
because when it's overdriving, it tends to overdrive a little smoother than the standard. The standard 12AY7 isn't better or worse. It's just more garage punky
Yeah.
when it overdrives. I tried different 12AX7s, and that's actually something where, again, just replacing, because right now I have a long play 12AX7 in there, which tends to be
Mm.
a little bit more low end, a little bit higher. I think more extended dissension than highs, a little bit more relaxed mid range. And I like that in there. But there's some short plates that if you really want to get some good rock tones, I would go with like a medium or short plate 12AX7. Again, this is the beauty of this amp, is that you can do, if you like tube sniffing, and having, actually, I do have some artists that play my amps, and they are the tube sniffer types, and they're having a blast.
Yeah. That's really awesome. Just being able to really, I don't know, like, hear the differences, and not only just to have a better understanding of the different textures that can
Mhm,
kind of be taken away, or added. You were talking about 12AX7s. I mean, that's what you hear. It's like the preamp tubes are always 12AX7s, and the speaker is probably a vintage 30. And those are like two things that specifically, to my understanding and to my ears, have this upper mid range
mhm,
spikiness almost, and they reinforce each other in, I feel like, most amp and speaker combinations. But that's like what we've come to like know as what a guitar sounds like.
yeah,
And so, but being able to kind of veer away from that, and then, I don't know, if not for anything else, but to kind of break the norm and understand these different textures is really cool.
yeah.
So the Polaris, that came, you said, after the Quantum Zen.
Yeah. So the Polaris came from a need from some artists to want who wanted a higher power amp. for who knows why. Because stage volumes seem to be going down, but some people still like to blast it pretty loud. So it gave me kind of an opportunity because the Quantum Zen was kind of it started as a collaboration with Scott from Zen Guitar Trading. Um, he, we tried like 10 different transformers, 20 different speakers, different wirings, but he always had a part in helping define the tone that he wanted as well. The Polaris kind of represent a moment where I can take the Quantum Zen design and run away with it in my own way. And one of my favorite tubes to kind of mess with is the EL34s. I think if you really tune it just right, it has like this. It has a sweeter chime than 6L6s, and it to my ears when you drive it, it's a little bit more musical. Um, not in every circuit, but if you really tune it for such a thing, I think at EL34 in terms of that kind of sweet compression has a little bit more potential than a 6L6. They're kind of bucking the trend because most, if you look at like boutique amps out there, the popular ones, right? I think the 6V6s and 6L6s seem to be dominating, or kind of
Hmm.
like the current flavor of the month or whatever flavor of the decade,
Yeah.
or whatever. And so this kind of represents an opportunity to take an EL34 and do something that you don't expect from it. Most EL34s you think Marshall, right? Um, and it is definitely not a Marshall sound. So two things I changed. One was, well, obviously the EL34s, but so I'm not claiming that. But the two other things I changed was instead of a EF86. So the way I wire my EF86, the bad rap EF86 has is like it's microphonic and it's noisy, but that's because they designed those stages poorly in the vintage designs, and everyone just copied those poor designs.
Yeah.
Um, so it doesn't have that problem in Quantum Zen. However, because I am obsessive and control freaky about my gear, I don't want to run any risk of any microphonics, even though it's still like the Polaris, the power out. It's a 30-watt amp, so it's still within the what I would consider satisfactory in terms of not having microphonic issues. I still don't want to risk it. It was close enough where I was just like, let's try something else. So what I did was I used this old it's an old technique from like in the olden days, back when they used tubes and radios, and to get more performance out of a triode, a dual triode, like 12AX7, 12A, every 12-7s.
Yeah.
They wired it a certain way. It's called a cascode. Something I'm blanking on the word. Setup where you're basically using both triodes to make actually a single gain stage, but mimicking a pentode. So it's technically wiring it like a pentode. So I'm making in this case, I found the 12AU7 work the best. I'm making a 12AU7 behave like a EF86. Now, because it's a
Mm.
dual triode, the parts are bigger, they're more robust, so you don't have to worry about those microphonic issues. I can still dial in that compression, that kind of natural sweet compression that the Quantum Zen has with the EF86, and I can tune it just the same. So obviously because it's a different tube, it's going to behave a little different. So it's
Right.
the tone is a little firmer versus the Quantum Zen, the EF86 is a little more squishy. Not necessarily better or worse, it's just different. And I think that fit the Polaris better because, again, I get to run away with what I wanted. So what I
Right.
wanted was an AC30 killer. That's actually not my phrase I came up with. That's actually Brian Sowers from Sour Sound. I told him like, hey, this is what I want from the Polaris. And after like, he read my mind before I even finished my sentence. He's like, he cut me off halfway and he's like, oh, you want an AC30 killer? And I was like, yeah. Like, the light bulb, or the glass shatter or whatever you want to call it. But suddenly I was like, oh yeah, that's the perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to have EL84s, four of them running super hot, like Vox. I wanted it to be able to do the same thing that an AC30 can, but it can also go into that kind of vintage tweed territory when
Hmm.
it's clean. Because the thing about AC30s, I love its drive tones. I'm not as big a fan of its clean tones. I know that's contrary to sorry, all the U2 fans out there. um, uh, some reason it's a little too um, I wouldn't say lack personality because definitely has a lot of personality. It's not the personality I'm looking for when I want a big clean tone.
Yeah.
And so uh again, so the Polaris came about being like, I want this big, huge, very three-dimensional clean tone, but when you drive it, it's just gets sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. Um and again, because I'm not locked into a partnership, I can kind of run away with it. So the output transformer on the Polaris is this huge chunk of metal that Brian came up with. It's basically as big as an AC30, maybe even bigger. Um, and it's probably like half the weight of the amp is the output transformer,
Wow.
but it is big and 3D like, and it just lets the EL34s just kind of do its thing. It kind of lets it run away with all the expansive, I don't know, whatever the jingly words I can use. Uh yeah, and then I did other things like, again, running away with it. The Quantum Zen is already super rich, so I don't need to make it richer. EL34s, on the other hand, when driven, they're super rich, but when clean, sometimes it can be a little, I wouldn't say boring.
Kind of
Um,
stale, maybe.
yeah, some of them can be a little stale. And so I wanted to compensate for that. As you saw, I have this unique baffle construction where I
Mhm.
use a bi-wood construction. So it's actually, most people just use, most good companies use like Baltic birch plywood as their baffles. Um, and I use that because the nice thing about Baltic birch is you don't have to worry about that thing bending or shifting because on temperature, humidity, right?
Right.
It's very stable. But I like the tone of sapele, which is like a mahogany. It's very similar to mahogany. So I make a tone ring out of sapele that the speaker actually mounts to. And just like what mahogany does to guitar, it does the same thing to a baffle. It enhances and brings out some of that rich low mids
Hmm.
that sometimes I think an EL34 doesn't have as much as like a 6L6 or 6V6. Those beautiful rich low mids. So it basically just takes the EL8034's that rich, that low mid, and just makes it thicker and woodier. And again, this is, all my designs are intentional. I'm there's a destination I'm trying to get to, and these are the tools I use, and how do I get there. So the sapele, it takes a lot of effort to kind of carve that and inset it. It's actually inset
Man.
into it, so it's structurally stronger than just a pure Baltic ply, but it also um, has that rich characteristics of sapele, which is, sounds like mahogany.
Yeah.
Um, so again, over engineered because I'm obsessive in that way. We're crazy. So I really should be charging more for it than I do. Just a little hint, wink, wink, right?
Yeah.
Um, in case you're thinking of one. And it takes a lot of labor hours to make one of just the cabinet for the Polaris.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think it's worth it because when you really crank it and when you drive it and you hear that sapele and the working with the Baltic birch ply, and then it's also the cabinet is hand selected pine and it's finger joined all the way around. So the front face here, I designed that purpose. It's actually finger jointed in as well, because so that it basically adds like a big reverberation box. So my goal is, because I really don't like reverb circuits in an amp.
Yeah.
Um, actually kind of despise them because for certain reasons. And so I wanted to make it have natural reverb. And so that's why I have these hand selected pine cabinets that I make it out of, so that it naturally reverberates and sounds big. So hopefully convincing most people that maybe you don't need reverb, or you could just use a reverb pedal, right?
Yeah.
Because honestly, reverb pedals are way more versatile and reliable than reverb circuits in an amp.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement there. But I think you said something like earlier, with all these micro decisions, you're kind of coming to a specific goal, and that was my favorite thing, even in the shit context of a loud showroom. like it's musical. You feel
Mhm.
that and you can hear it. It's the combination of both, and it's the sum of all of its parts, and you kind of chasing this vision along the way, to where it's extremely musical and pleasant, clean, and really sweet and rich as it starts to drive and distort. And that's the perfect amp. I'm excited to have it here. It's going to be the pedal demo amp. But being able to like have that and put it, like downstairs, with all the mics,
Yeah.
in cabs and stuff, and be able to like really crank it, and that's the sound of records. And that's something that for me personally, like that's, my main gig is playing on records. And so just getting that sound where you can feel it and it's extremely musical,
Yeah.
I think that plays a big part in the art and hobby and expression of playing guitar, is like that feedback loop with the gear that you're using. It's cool to have the gear,
Right.
but using it, completing that connection there, that's where the magic is, and that's the thing that I'm like always chasing,
Yeah.
um, is that feedback loop, and that's can be achieved in so many different ways, and we all have all these preferences and opinions that inform
Mm.
that as well. Um, but yeah, it's musical is the thing
Yeah.
that stands out to me with that. And so,
I think
and go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think you nailed on right on the head because my ultimate goal is just to have a piece of equipment that inspires you to come up with new ideas or new sounds or, you know, get that creative juice flowing, right? That's one reason why I like weird pedals is because if I'm in a musical rut, I put a pedal in that's messes with me and I come up with new ideas. And I'm not saying that this is, messy, but um I think also to your point earlier, what you said about, primarily recording, this would be, again, yay, because would be a perfect amp, I think, for you, because one of the biggest feedback I get from recording engineers, from artists that use my amps and go in the recording studio is that the recording engineers love this amp because I get a lot of feedback, like sometimes emails from recording engineers being like, your amp came in the other day and I didn't even have to EQ it.
Yeah,
And that's a thing where so there's a challenge between making something sound good in a living room and something good in a recording because often they're not the same thing.
yeah, yeah,
And one of the challenges with both the Quantum Zen and this is I wanted to make it sound good in both, because if it doesn't sound good in the living room, it's not going to inspire you to play.
yeah,
If it doesn't sound good in the recording studio, you're never going to use it or on a record. And so that came up. That's the reason I did the tone stack the way I did it, is because it doesn't kill the mid range like the traditional tone stack does. And mid range is where the guitar lives, but at the same time, you can't kill all the other stuff that kind of makes it sound nice in the living room, right? Um, and so it is very mid forward, even though it doesn't sound like it, because it doesn't kill all the other stuff that we usually associate with things that are mid forward.
right.
Um, and and that was a deliberate design choice, or not choice. It was a struggle, design, a challenge, and I think I got a really good solution, at least from based on the feedback I'm getting from a lot of the recording engineers. But yeah, just um, that's one of the coolest feedbacks you can get is from, as an amp builder, is from recording engineers that being like, oh, I love your thing, it's so easy to record. And yeah. So I just had to share that thing.
Yeah, no,
My
that's,
vote.
I mean, that's absolutely true. That's the mid range is so delicate, because that's where the guitar lives, and there's all this information from either ends of the mid range that inform the rest of it. But
Mhm.
I mean, that's always my goal, whether I'm, like showing up to a festival or showing up to track, is I want to do all the work beforehand, knowing what the sounds that are going to come out of that amp well before I play anything so that I can, hopefully have them do no adjusting. Obviously like there's
Yeah.
post processing things, but like there's a difference when you have to EQ something in the mixing process, and
Mhm.
really that just means like fixing it
Right.
because the what you hear out of the speaker with your ears is just different than what a microphone hears.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that you what we've decided it sounds good, live right in front of you is just so much different than what a
Mhm.
microphone needs to hear. Uh,
Yeah.
and so striking that balance is difficult. And with that wattage control, you're not having to sacrifice a feeling um, when you're playing in a bedroom, when you're
Right.
getting inspired, when you're writing something that may not happen to be, with a microphone in front of it and, all set up into
Mhm.
the rig or whatever. So that's a difficult thing to balance, but man, I'm beyond excited
Awesome.
to get that thing and play on some records and with my record coming up especially. But and be able to have like a something that I can compare pedals to, like this consistent or this constant here, that's like, okay, now everything can kind of be judged, compared to each other. I think that's going to be a huge staple just for me as I mean, that's my favorite thing is to get pedals and plug them in and then I come
Mhm.
up with a sound. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what this song needed.
Yeah.
And having something to know that I can use for that and I can crank it to get its own thing is kind of a magic combination there.
Yeah.
So
Some.
where's the best way for people to find out more about both the Polaris and the Quantum Zen? But also, you have some dealers
Yep.
uh, and all that information on your website.
Yes. My website, eddiewanginstruments.com is, yeah, has my list of dealers on there as well. Got a couple up and coming dealers that, still working with. Hopefully um, we can work with them. But yeah, I have a few dealers across the country. Um, if it's easier because it's always nice to try first. But I also have a really good return policy on if you do want to try it and people bring it in and you take it in for try it for a week and you're just like, yeah, it's just not working for me. Yeah, I don't, whatever, just send it back. I'd rather people be happy with what they have than not happy.
Yeah.
Wait, yeah, and have to live with it. So yeah, I mean, even then, I have a really good return policy. Um, even the shipping is um pretty reasonable because I do a huge discount on shipping back in case. And then yeah, and then I'm always Quantum Zen's like always sold out. So there's currently a 4 to 6 week lead time on the Quantum Zen. The Polaris, I don't make as much because naturally because it's more expensive. But that also has a lead time just because it takes a whole lot of hours just to make one.
Yeah.
Um, and it's all because of that cabinet. Yeah, usually if you order direct, it's the lead times generally I would say on good months about 3 to 4 weeks. Um, which I think is still pretty reasonable in today's boutique world.
Yeah.
If that's what I am, boutique, right? Um,
Yeah. It's another one of those terms that gets thrown around
yeah,
where I'm
there it
not
is.
sure that it has meaning anymore or something.
Right, right. Top
But
quality handmade shit.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just hand selected everything. Yeah, and again, if you try it, you don't like, because it's what I think it sounds awesome. It doesn't necessarily mean what other people think sounds awesome. So, yeah, again, really good return policy, but as long as you don't go sledding with it or something like that. Um, It's all good. But generally the satisfaction rate has been really high. I mean, people when they most of my sales comes from dealers, from when people go in the shop not looking for an amp, but being like, "Oh yeah, I want to," they go into the shop because they saw online they had like a vintage Les Paul or a custom shop Les Paul or something like that or whatever, and they go in and they intend to buy the Les Paul, but then they plug into my amp and they go home with my amp instead. um, so I mean, most of my sales are through dealers, which is why I keep trying to expand my dealer network. Um, yeah, because amps are one of those things a guitar you can kind of tell what it's going to sound ish like based on its specs and what it looks like. And let's be honest, most people buy guitars with their eyes,
Yeah,
right? As long as it plays good,
yeah,
right? The setup is good, the craftsmanship is good. You can kind of get away with shopping for guitars with your eyes. Not always, but good amount of time.
yeah,
Amps are not like that. There's some amps that look great and I plugged in and just like I hate this thing. Um and so
yeah,
yeah, I understand that. So that's why again, dealer's probably the best way to try them, but if not, I do have a return policy. And um but yeah, I think overall everyone's been super excited and happy with the amp. I haven't had to deal with the, knock on wood, returns at all.
yeah,
Except one, I think there's been a couple times where people like, I love the Quantum Zen. I just wish it would be louder. And we exchanged it for Polaris instead. So those are like the number one reasons for return is to upgrade to the Polaris.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, never the other way, sadly. Like Polaris is too much for me. I need something quiet. Oh, try the Quantum Zen. Um,
yeah, yeah. That
by
I
the
feel
way,
like
hearing loss is a real issue. It's another reason the wattage control is important to me because we all love the sound of crank amps, but it's so bad for our hearing. And
yeah,
I my dad worked next to a audiologist when I was a little kid, and I remember going into helping at the office and going and exploring the audiology office and finding out how many people are actually deaf is pretty scary.
yeah,
Not deaf, but with significant hearing loss.
yeah. That's like my biggest fear because I feel like if anything happens to my hearing and if anything happens to my hands,
Ooh, yeah,
I like what do I do with my life? And so
right.
that's a reason why I have a dedicated space to crank amps. That's not in the same room, because yeah, it's
Oh
hard to do
yeah,
that. But nowadays, I think it's less common. It's I don't think people know how to play loud as
yeah,
much anymore. That was my experience through teaching. Is like let's, you know, if we're practicing for a rock show,
right.
then let's practice for a rock show. Like you need to stand up and
Hmm,
you need to hear the amp. But I think there's just it's less common. Um, but I
yeah.
don't know. There's a lot of local shows. My younger brother is plays in like the local scene in Memphis, and there's no. I mean, there's a mic for the singer slash sometimes screamer,
Hmm.
um, and no matter what, you can never hear the vocalist. It's just not.
Oh
You
yeah,
you hear cymbals and you hear distortion.
too loud. Yeah.
But, and they're all playing these, like, modded high watts that are 200 watts, and
Oh yeah. Ouch.
yeah,
I mean, I'm not going to take away the fun factor because I've stood in front of a Marshall stack or haven't tried it with a high watt yet, but definitely with Marshall, the 100 watters and you crank it and you play that power chord and it just pumps your heart for you. There's something fun about that, but it's
yeah,
horrible and it will probably and yeah, a little PSA for hearing loss, right? You lose it, it's gone forever. So
yeah,
yeah, I mean that's the other thing with the reason I develop a wattage control is because I also have very sensitive hearing. I hear a lot of details, but also I don't really like loud for too long. And it's kind of weird being a gigging musician, but I've always had musicians earplugs Whenever I go, especially even today when I go see gigs, I carry them with me just in case. Because
Oh, I
I
do
don't know,
too.
I just the loud noises when it's too loud, it hurts, and I don't enjoy it. Um,
Yeah.
and like what you're saying, when people are cranking their amps so loud you can't even hear the singer, I hate that. Um,
Yeah.
I
It's a
mean,
different it's like I think it
mm,
serves a different purpose in that capacity, but I mean, like, just I mean,
yeah,
frankly, as I've gotten older, like, it's not enjoyable, and
yeah.
yeah, I always have, like, those ear racers,
Oh,
always,
nice.
any concert I go to, just because I'm like, it's just not worth like, no matter what, it's not worth walking away and not being able to work tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah,
You know what I mean? Like,
exactly, right.
and if I can't hear, if I feel like I've got, tissue paper in my ears,
Mhm.
or a high-end ringing, I yeah, I get, like, obsessive over that because it's such a big fear. Because 'cause I'm like, I'm this is all I got. I don't know how to do
Right.
anything but play guitar, so my hands and my hearing.
It's your livelihood.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
but,
this kind another plug for or sorry, plug for the plug for my tone stack, but the part of the reason I also developed that unique tone stack is because I think one of the reasons guitars keep turning up live is because they can't hear themselves, and one of the reasons they can't hear themselves is because a lot of amps, the vintage tone stack that everyone copies has very little mid-range,
yep,
and, there's this thing called masking, right? And also in the studio and recording where, we hear the louder thing, and so when you have a bass, you have drums, you have any other instrument, um, your amp may sound great in the living room with all that bass, but then the moment you play with other instruments, it's like it's gone. Um, and part of the I don't know, you saw my amps had this little charm switch. I call that the living room and the live, band switch because when you turn it down, it cuts the low end. Not cuts, it cleans up the low end.
mhm,
So it's clearer in a live situation. So you don't have to turn up to hear yourself. And also the tone stack because it doesn't kill all your mid range like traditional tone stacks do. Um, you can still hear yourself easier without having to turn up loud. And that was another goal is I wanted people to stop turning up because they couldn't hear themselves.
yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah, it's like, yeah, I think almost and, like, I'm speaking to myself here, and this is something I had to learn the hard way, especially being the young kid in the studio, it just people are already, like, maybe a little nervous about what's about to happen. I had to
Mm,
learn the hard way that, basically always you need less gain than you think,
mhm.
and it needs to be way more mid-range focused and almost no low end.
Yeah.
Because, it's like the extreme of that is like the sound of a metal zone, um, which is like
It's
the
cool.
most scooped, no mid-range and a lot of low end where it
Right.
feels big and fat. But the funny thing is, and specifically about that pedal, is that you've got like a Q factor and a variable mid-range focus
Mhm.
point. The way to use that pedal, it doesn't sound the way that people think it sounds. Like that's not an inherent sound because of the
Yeah.
parametric EQ. Like you can make that a focused point mig sound that doesn't sound like,
Yeah.
a Metallica album. But
Right.
yeah, I think you hit it right on the nose there that it's most of the time you really just need more mid-range because if there's no mid-range there, then you're just disappearing in the mix,
Yeah.
with all the other instruments. Um,
Though
yeah, that
I
charm
love the middle zone.
yeah.
If you know how to use it, that's the thing.
Yeah,
If you can use it, figure out how to use it right. That's such a sweet thing. But if you're just doing it because you want to sound like the name is misleading, I think. Because then people
yeah,
are like, "Oh, I'm gonna sound like metal." But if you know how to use it, can get some really cool textures and sounds out of it. That's not metal, but yeah,
yeah.
it's a cool pedal.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's funny because I'm like, that pedal really is an extremely like utilitarian pedal. Like it
Yeah,
is, you've got,
surprisingly.
yeah, I mean, you've just got an active uh 3-band EQ with a variable um Q for the mid range, and then you've got plenty of gain on tap, but you don't have to turn it all the way up. You know,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
it's an EQ pedal with like guitar overdrive distortion
Yeah.
just cascaded a trillion times on the front end. But like,
Right. Yeah.
but you know, you don't have to turn it up. Yeah, that's really funny. That's it. Yeah,
I'm
I've
gonna go
thought about doing a video of like 4 metal zones, you
Yeah.
know, and it's just like,
How do you use Metal Zone for jazz
yeah,
or
exactly. Yeah, there's
country? Right, yeah. Because you
yeah,
can, it actually does it really well. But yeah,
yeah,
anyways,
it can do all of that. But
been like
um
2 decades since I've owned one, and now I think I'm gonna go you sold me on it. I'm gonna go buy a used one somewhere.
yeah, well, I'm selling myself. I don't have one right now. I've had one like 2 or 3 times before, and it's just it's one of those pedals that like the DL4. I've owned
Mhm.
6 DL4s
Oh, nice.
because I get one and I love it, and then I go, "Oh, it doesn't have the one subdivision that you need to play pop music."
Hmm.
And then I sell it, and then I go, "You know, it'd be awesome if I had a DL4." And then
Right,
it's a cycle that continues. But yeah,
right.
I feel the same way.
Regas or what it's called?
Do what?
Regas? Gas
Yeah,
acquisition syndrome
regas.
again, 2nd time, right?
Yeah,
Or grass.
grass.
Gear reacquisition syndrome.
Yeah, that's real. That's a real thing because
Oh, no, yeah.
I mean, that's almost always now in my obsessive scrolling through like Reverb and
Mhm.
used guitar gear everywhere is like, you know, the dumb crappy gear that I had when I was a kid, like in my bedroom playing. Like it would be awesome to find that whatever model practice amp crate just to like just to look at it almost. Like
Yeah,
but it would be so interesting to like what does that thing sound like and how did
yeah,
that inform, you know, me all the way down the road. The same way it's like
nice.
the Dan Electro plastic Fab
Oh,
series
yeah.
pedals. Yeah. I had
Those are
the
cool
red
though.
distortion and it was like my dad
What's
had
your
taught me how to do feedback and then it was game over.
nice. What would be your number 1 grass gear reacquisition, piece of gear?
I think so like a year ago, a year and a half ago, I think I got it, which is this absurd tie-dye Fender Strat.
Oh, nice.
And it was like the first guitar that I got that
First.
like my parents didn't get me. Like I cut grass and I was like
Huh.
12 or 13 and I bought it for $450. And it's like a Korean made like shredder. It's more of a Jackson, honestly, than it is a Fender Strat. But and then I got rid of it. I traded it. I know exactly what I did. It was one of the hundreds of trades I did at Guitar Center for where I always got screwed. Like
Hmm.
you always get
Yeah,
screwed if you trade something in a Guitar Center. And
yeah,
so
absolutely.
I traded this for a line 6 something um and a couple pedals from the used cabinet. And I regretted it. So I think this was the one. I don't know that I mean there is
Nice.
I want to recreate my like first pedal board.
Oh, yeah,
And it had like a talk box on it. Just
yeah.
so stupid. Like, I mean, what was I
Those
doing?
things are cool.
I mean, a talk box is really cool when like Joe Perry does it, but
Mhm.
it's not cool when I do it. But I want to recreate that. Um, and then like how I remember I had Audacity and like this weird computer microphone, like it was just an eighth inch um TRRS like little microphone, and I hung it over the like little speaker that goes to the talk box tube to like
Mm.
add a weird overdub guitar with the
Oh,
rhythm.
that's cool. Yeah.
And it was like in Audacity, and I was, staying up all night. That's what I was doing. While other people played sports, I was doing crap like that.
You're messing with talk box setups. Yeah.
Yeah. So what
Nice.
what would be
That's why I like
your regas?
regas. Ooh, I got a couple. So I got boring one and more exciting one. I guess a boring one would be bigger power supplies. 'Cause I'm always like, oh, I can go with a simpler rig and go down to 3 pedals. I mostly play with no pedals, but I still have pedal boards to like
Yeah.
spark creativity and mess around with. And then every time I sell the bigger pedal power supply, I go down to the 3 pedals, and I'm always just like, ah, that pedal looks so nice. I add another one and add another one, and then suddenly I'm like, I need a new power supply. Okay, that's my boring one. Um, Probably the interesting that you picked a guitar, probably the Telecaster, because Telecasters, I've sold so many and bought so many.
Yeah.
Because like my first, I remember I grew my first guitar I bought from, I bought myself was a Strat. Now I saw as a Strat guy because Jimi Hendrix. But then I remember picking up my first Telecaster, and I bought it just like for shits and giggles because like I was at Guitar Center and they dropped it. Not me, Guitar Center did, and it put like tons of dings all over it. And they're like, "Oh, we'll just give this away for cost or whatever." So I just bought it, and then I was just like fell in love with it, and I was like, "This is awesome." But after like a couple of years of it, I was, you're what regular gas, right? Which is basically like, wow, there's so much other stuff out there. Yeah, I've always been like a one guitar guy. Never, wanted like two or three guitars. One just like one instrument to kind of bond with and just be my
Mhm.
thing. So in order to get another guitar, I had to sell that one. So I sold Telly, had another guitar. And after like what, not even a month or two, I missed the Telly. So I'd be like, okay, so start shopping for another Telly. I probably did this maybe 5 times before like I hit my 40s and realized I just like a Telly.
Yeah.
And now I have that. There's that blue one right there that I, I, I hang on to, won't sell. Um, yeah, and then I made my own. That that
Mhm.
one, that one is half my own. Then and then now I'm having Tausch make one for me. Reiner. I'm just like, yeah, I want one instrument to bond with, but I'm sick of tellies. This might be the whole thing again. So I'm not going to
Yeah.
sell that telly. I'm going to give it to my daughter, so I can always take it back.
Yeah.
Because I learned my lesson that it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But I just think it'd be cool. It's cool to have an instrument that a friend of yours made. Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I'm having a guitar by Reiner, and then um, yeah, I guess that's sort of a maybe kind of boring because it probably happened to a lot of people. I don't know why, but something about a Telecaster, you can kind of do everything with it.
Yeah.
Um,
I
it's
I
not
think
limited like other guitars. I feel often.
yeah. Yeah, there's something about a telly, but I think there's also, like, I don't know, there are people that understand what we're talking about, and there's people that just could never relate, but it's a lot to have in common with somebody because I mean, me and my younger brother, and I think we were on the probably extreme end of the spectrum, but, like, in no exaggeration of numbers, each had 30 different amps
Wow.
and maybe a few less guitars. But,
Maybe
and
you
the
should have been an
majority of
amp
that,
builder.
and it was just trading, wheeling and dealing,
Mm.
as teenagers on Craigslist, in so many hilariously ridiculous situations where me and my brother, who's probably 12, and I'm 16 or something, and we're in a like pay by the month hotel trading Vox, some kind of Vox like 212. It wasn't an AC30, it was some variant. And anyways, to the like the most cigarette ash smelling hotel room, weird situation trading for a Jackson, this like gunmetal gray Jackson from the 80s. Just so many of those like experiences. But yeah, there's some of the things that I kept coming back to, and I'm having Tausch. Um, I just put in my order like a month ago,
Oh,
and
nice.
I'm just so excited. I knocked the bucket list out with the Tyler here. This was my like dream
Oh,
guitar since I was 13.
sweet.
Is a Burning Water,
Look at that.
and so it this is like can do everything. It
Yeah.
I don't know. I've always wanted one, and it's everything I ever hoped it would be. It's a lot riding on like a couple decades of dreaming about having this guitar. But it totally lives up to it. But it's totally different than my former number one, which was it's a PRS over there, but it's HSH and it's um, maple neck, but it's a swamp ash body, and it's
Oh,
kind of
nice.
like a do it all thing.
Is that the
But
PRS scale one? The
yeah,
25 inch?
yeah, it's this. So this
Oh,
is
very
kind of
nice.
like what my Tausch is kind of the design inspired by. But
That's gonna be a
uh,
humbucker HSH,
yeah,
HSH again? Yeah, cool.
HSH, and then like the 6 point trim, because the I've got the Godo 510 on the Tyler, which is a much more modern trim, but such a different feel. Um, it's just because it's floating. Um,
Mhm.
it's more I can pull off things with that, and I think it sounds and feels amazing, but it's different. A vintage trim that's not like floating. There's a it's closer to a Telecaster, like where you're feeling everything. There's not.
Oh, huh.
It doesn't feel like way up in the air. Um, so I'm really excited about the Tausch kind of being the I don't know ultimized version of that PRS.
Nice.
Its function for me, and I feel like that's going to be the one that I connect with. Like I think that's going to be the one, which clearly like I've never been a single instrument guy, but there's always it kind of rotates which one, but I feel like this Tausch is kind of
Sweet.
the dream in the head. So
You're gonna have to show it off when you get it, 'cause
yeah,
I'm excited.
yeah, I'm
Excited for you.
I'm real stoked. Well, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna have y'all's NAMM booth rig
Yeah. Sweet, there you go.
just right in the studio. But um, well, I don't
That'd
want
be
to take too much of your time here. I know we're at um, an hour 40.
Oh,
Uh,
wow, yeah. Well, I mean, we could talk forever 'cause,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
think uh
Go ahead.
oh, yeah, I was gonna say that that single instrument mentality comes from, like, the classical world. It's, like, what
Yeah,
I grew up with, right? You find that one violin or one cello, and you bond with it because it's your instrument. Guitar is different, the guitar world's different. It's a lot of different pressures kinda pulling at you, right? You have,
yeah,
like, the Strat sound and the Les Paul sound. You can't really do one without the other. The other doesn't do the other thing very well.
yeah,
Um, and it's its own kind of, there's more writing your own music in guitar world, which means that having different gear inspires different ideas and sounds.
yeah,
So it makes more sense, which, I've been kind of wrestling with that for a while. Like, um, I like being a single instrument guy because I can be like, I know this thing in and out. And I've always bonded with a Telecaster because, same thing. Like if you see my designs, they're simple as basic as I can make it. I like the Tele because it looks like someone did just slap some pickups on a plank of wood,
Yeah.
and there's beauty in that, even though it's an ugly beauty. Um,
Mhm.
but I like that. It looks like a plank of wood that someone just like, and it works.
Yeah.
And you can't mess with it. I mean, like, you don't have to worry. My Tele stays in tune forever. It only changes. Like I only have to tune it once. Whatever. But anyways, um, but yeah, I've always struggled with that personally. Like, do I get more guitars because it inspires new sounds, or do I just keep what I have and bond with it? And good luck. I don't have an
Yeah.
answer for that one.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's guitar is, uh, the journey of being a guitar player and chasing tone, and I think tone can be in that meaning just the pursuit of playing guitar and expressing yourself, much like life is like the journey is the destination.
Hmm.
You're never gonna, anytime and I'll say it again, I'm sure, but like anytime I'm like, well, this is the pedal board. It's done.
Right.
Well, it's never done
Right.
because talking about regas, like I said, the DL4, I've owned
Right.
it's at
There it is
least
again.
6 of them. I've owned probably a Rat pedal 5 or 6 times,
Mm,
and I get sick of it, and then I go to something else, and then I miss it, and then I get it again, and it's just this, but, like, that's I don't know. That's the thing that is fun. That's the thing that consumes,
yeah.
my work and,
Mm,
non-work time. It's I'm working, I'm messing with guitar pedals and getting
right.
sounds and writing music, and then in my free time, I'm looking at pedals and finding other ways to get inspired. That's
Yeah.
part of it, but
I always say that's
uh,
a lot healthier than a lot of other habits
for sure. Yeah, yeah. I'm trying,
or addictions, I should say.
yeah, there's a lot worse, like doom scrolling is what
Mm,
I guess
right.
people are calling it now. You're just scrolling through whether Instagram, like social media, and I'd rather scroll through people selling equipment, and
Right.
so I think that addiction happened before the social media thing kind of consumed all of our lives, and
The
so
world. Yeah.
yeah, for better or worse, but yeah,
Yeah,
no,
that's another discussion for another hour and a half.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Oh, very
Um,
cool.
well, man, thanks for doing this interview. I think that's something I'm trying to do is just interview different artists from, like regional artists from across the country, people that watch the video probably have never heard of unless they live in the region that this
Mm,
artist plays around. And then also, like gear folk, whether you're a builder or, um, you know, I've got a couple interviews with people that work at some of the larger places, and just it's a lot to have in common with somebody. I think, like being in
yeah.
this space and having this passion that then, we're all going, well, can I make this my job somehow? And
Yeah.
so, um, I think it's cool to kind of dive in deep on some of that stuff. At least I find it just fascinating knowing how all those micro decisions, happened to create something. But
Yeah. I like that. It's all micro decisions.
yeah, yeah, I don't
And
know
then
where I came up with that, but somebody said it.
and then adapting, because sometimes all those micro decisions don't lead you to where you thought it was gonna go.
Oh yeah, rarely I've found, at least for me.
But that's why, yeah, that's why you pay attention to those little tiny details. Because when you do need to adapt, you're like, "Oh, yeah, I got my recipe book here where I can rely on."
Yeah, yeah,
So,
I
yeah,
learned,
come
uh, yeah, at a
going
young age.
first full circle to the beginning of our conversation there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, rounding it all out. Um, yeah, with the amp, um, if you just want to let me know
Yeah, it should be done soon. I'm halfway done wiring it. That's the last part I gotta do is just wire it and then plug it in and test it for a few days to make sure nothing blows up.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's shipped your way. Yeah. So I mean, this part's all done. This part sounds amazing. So I'm excited about that. And then trying to think. Oh yeah, your Polaris is the first one where it's not screen printed. The logos and the words and stuff like that. The labels are not screen printed on. It's actually lasered
Oh, wow.
from the
That's
local
cool.
laser engraver, and we lasered both sides. So it's a little bit more durable that way.
Yeah.
Because again the chassis is a single piece aluminum and it's anodized, so it's tougher because aluminum's kind of soft, and then you
Right.
anodize it, hardens the surface. And then I had used to do screen printing, but screen printing the ink can scratch off eventually or something like that.
Yeah.
So again, my constant pursuit to make things better and better, I got all my Polaris chassis to be laser engraved instead. And so
That's
you'll
awesome.
have the first laser engraved Polaris. Yeah,
Dude.
it's a different texture, of course, because it's in the anodizing instead of
Right.
a film of ink on top. Whoops. Um, so it looks different. It's the ink will pop a little bit more, but it's less durable. But the laser engraving, it's like it's part of the. It looks like it's part of the texture. It blends a little bit.
Yeah, I think personally, I have a preference, I think, towards laser engraving,
Who
and
doesn't like
it's just
lasers?
cool because it's friggin' lasers. So, like
Yeah,
like, I at night, whenever I'm, like, done working, because I have, like, crazy hours, so I
yeah.
work in the middle of the night, and then I have, like, at 2 AM and 3 AM, I have alarms to be like, "Hey, once you finish what you're doing." But
Oh, nice.
so trying to get to sleep, I'll watch, like, woodworking and laser engraving videos just because
Yeah.
it's cool.
Yeah, when they finished, the engraver, we're talking about, like, posting pictures on Instagram, and I was like, "Wait, you didn't take a little video of it being engraved?" Oh, like,
Yeah,
come on, that would've been the coolest part.
yeah,
I'll have to get him to do it next time, but yeah. Yeah, so I'm excited. I'm eager for you to get this one finally
yeah.
and rock out.
I'm
Sweet.
really excited
I
for
think
it.
using the same amp for all the demos is very smart because one of the things I've been noticing lately that I watch a lot of like comparison videos is not necessarily because I care about the comparison, like, oh, this pedal versus that pedal,
Right.
right? It's more because I you need another thing to have like a basis of the bass tone to compare to,
Yeah,
right? Because there's so many pedal demos that are like they sound amazing, and then you get the pedal like, oh, this doesn't work at all.
right.
Um, um, Part of the reason is because they tune all the gear to fit that pedal, whatever. But yeah, I've been watching a lot of comparison videos. Again, like in my mind, I'm just like, I don't really care about the comparison. I just need like a standard for something to be, because it is a comparison. When you buy a new rat pedal or a different version of a rat, or you
Yeah,
buy whatever delay that floats your boat, for me, it's like analog delays. I watch analog delay comparisons because I'm like, yeah, how does it compare to Electro Harmonix?
yeah,
Is it any better? Because if you just listen to it by itself, you're just like, well, why should I spend $200 on this thing? Um,
yeah,
but having the same amp, it's like, oh yeah, so I can compare all your demos to each other and be like, oh yeah, this is how it would sound. And yeah, it just makes a lot more sense to me, I think. Yeah.
yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's on one hand, it'll be like good for my YouTube channel as it, grows and over time, especially with working with a couple other companies now and hopefully doing a bunch
Sweet.
of stuff for like Seymour Duncan, having something to like be really consistent throughout all of them, I think is important. Like demoing pickups, like if you listen to two different demos with like two different players, two different
Right.
kinds of guitars,
Two
and
different
two
amps.
wildly different amps, it's like, well, how are you supposed to know
Right.
what the pickup sounds like? But also, like, just for me, just having something that I go, this is kind of like the basis that I mean, I guess the same thing as the YouTube video, just but for me, um, as I'm like going, because I'm always trying to like, what is the most find the most efficient way to get to the like right part
Yeah.
because that journey sometimes takes longer to come up with the right sounds and come up with the right part for whatever the song is for whatever artist. And so the more I can be efficient at that, the more it makes sense for me as a business, but also I want to skip all of the not fun stuff, like
I
it's
like that. That's a good way to put it.
it's which you can't avoid doing the
Yeah.
work. Um and there's work is always going to be work, but like you can find ways to maximize the fun.
Mhm.
Like the reason why I do this for a living is because I enjoy playing guitar. Sometimes I have to remind myself of that, but uh,
Right.
it's like how can I maximize that in the quickest way to get, you know, the most inspiring sounds. And so having an amp that's dedicated to that serves like such a functional purpose. And I'm working on my own music right now for the first time. And so I'm, about to hit tracking phase. So I'm really excited to have this amp in the mix
Very
for the
cool.
album. That's going to be really exciting. So,
Yay.
but
A lot of
well,
things to look
awesome. I
forward
don't
to.
want
Yeah.
to keep blabbing on here. I'll keep talking forever, but
Oh, no, me too. No, this has been fun. I could talk forever all day if you wanted to.
yeah, man.
Actually, I'm not a morning person, so I think I'm starting to wake up.
Hey, yeah, I'm with you. I don't know how people function in the morning. I just like
Yeah.
it's
Well,
just
those
different.
morning people, I'm always like, you know how you feel at like 11 p.m.? Yeah, that's how I feel at like 9 a.m.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's a morning person's world. So,
It is unfortunately. Yeah, I yeah. It's like that's been the struggle of my life. That and how dumb I think time zones are,
yeah.
and how many billions of dollars it would save to not have it.
Oh, yeah, don't get me started. Let's go back
Uh,
to sundials. That would work
yeah,
easier.
exactly. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, and that's where I go. You know what? I need to go play
Yeah.
pedals for an hour and
Yeah, there you go.
like find my purpose again
You're
because
right. Vent that frustration in a healthier way.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
think,
man.
these are kind of things that you can't have you can never have enough. Having good artist relationships, having people play your stuff. Um, Again, like I'm just a one person show, so it's like I don't have a marketing wing of my company, right?
Right.
And that's why I like asking people like you or asking you and a couple other artists to help out. That's kind of I don't know. I think it's a win-win-win, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like it's a
it's trading
somewhat
labor.
crowded market, and at the end of the day, I think cool people um, deserve to be recognized, and I'm in a position to where hopefully I can get you, more amps sold and bring just more awareness to the stuff that you're doing because I think
Well, thanks.
I just think it should exist and more people need to know about it. Um,
Thank you.
and so I'm excited and I think yeah, it's definitely feels very mutual. And like we talked before, I feel fairly green. Like I'm trying to find, I feel like what my specific niche and purpose is, kind of in this whole gear world and music industry. And, for me, it's like, okay, well, I want to do long form interviews with people. And the things that I think are the coolest is hearing people's, what they may feel like is average journey to get to where they are. I don't know, that there's less of that for some
Yeah.
reason, and there's less of, like, acknowledging people as people, and, I don't think that anybody's avoiding that necessarily, but sometimes it just feels a little too, um it's just capitalism or
Yeah.
something.
Right.
And so I'm trying to, like, how do I strike this balance of, like, yeah, but it's like people, and we're like, none of us are
Yeah.
doing this because we think it's the most
Yeah.
advantageous financially,
Right. I
you
didn't
know?
pick this for the money.
Yeah.
There's so many other things I could be doing that would make a lot more money.
Oh my gosh, yeah, like, and so that's the thing that's magic that I feel like somehow isn't addressed, and so,
Mhm. Cool. Thank
the
you.
things that I can do about it is go, "Well, I wanna work with, like, cool people and not just, you know, not for any other reason." I just don't
Sweet.
think any other reason is good enough, but it's like, you're, eh, cool people, Rainer
Thank
Tausch is
you.
cool people, and Seymour Duncan is cool people, and it's like, "Whoa," like, this is you can enjoy who you work with and kind of I don't
Yeah.
know.
Sweet.
So,
Feelings
yeah, man.
mutual. I thank you. And the long form stuff is just better anyways. Like was it Vintage Amp podcast? They did an interview with Brian Sowers at Sour Sound, and I remember they just let him go, like talk about all the details. And they afterwards, even though like it went really long and very, very technical, they said that was like one of their like most listened to podcasts.
Wow.
So I think there's definitely a craving, I think, for more in-depth stuff.
Yeah.
Like why do people watch like that pedal show? They're
Yeah.
like an hour long, versus like 5-minute reviews or whatever. But then there's a craving for that kind of stuff where people like
Oh, yeah.
you listen to people contemplate about their decisions, why they do stuff, and it just a lot more meaningful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it when you anytime you condense something down to a minute, like, you have to sacrifice something. Like,
Right.
it's not like you're getting away with losing nothing, doing that, and, I mean, I feel that way personally. That's why I'm adamant about doing longer form content, because I have that desire for the depth, like, I watch every That Pedal show, even if I couldn't care about or
Hmm.
didn't know about whoever was on,
Yeah.
um, but it's because, it's more about, like, "Oh, I understand these people, and then how they're probably going to interact with this piece of gear or this other person,"
Hmm.
and I'm just exhausted by the 1 minute or 5
Hmm.
minute everything,
Oh
it's like,
yeah.
that's not really what I'm here for. This is just like, gear is just the vehicle of how I understand people in the
Yeah.
world
I
and
like that.
what I think is beautiful, and so, like, it's if it was just about you know, I don't know, that gets more into, like, it just feels like if it's just about capitalistic whatever, like, I'm not sure that that's what matters,
Hmm.
you know, or that's what drives people towards it. But no, yeah, I totally agree. That's well, and there's I just watched the big shootout. It's like a 2-hour video about specifically vintage 30s and different eras of vintage 30s
Oh, nice.
and the micro changes that happened with, like, the frame of the speaker that holds a magnet is a little bit thicker from this year to this year, and the dust cap material, and I don't know. It is an extremely, like, in-depth, super the most upper echelon of nerddom. Uh,
Nice. I
but
haven't checked that one out yet. I'm gonna have to now.
yeah, it's fascinating to me. Like, this is what keeps me up at
Yeah.
night that I'm thinking about. Like,
Well, it
um,
does. I mean, huge difference. Sorry, really. Hold on. Um, one one of the things that I remember, like Slush and Blues has. Oh, that should be another regas thingy. Not because I keep missing it, is because it's so hard to find a good one. Or you have to break it in for 5 years. I had one that I broke in for 5 years, and it was, like, lovely, and I stupidly sold it, and it was, like, been a big regret, like, "Oh, why did I let that one go?" And then I buy another one being like, "Maybe this one will be okay," and it's not. I have to break it in for another 5
Yeah.
years. I'm not that patient, so I sell it. But I was reading about who was it? It was again, one of those long form interviews, but they were talking about um, the paper pulp that they use to make the paper cones, and how in the vintage ones they had longer fiber paper pulp because I don't know why the trees were bigger or they just different
Yeah.
manufacturing process. But the new ones, the fibers are smaller, so that means there was more resin instead of paper,
Hmm.
and how that changed the tone. And I'm just like, ooh, I'm totally geeking out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's the hard thing with speakers is that you can't like the used market for speakers. Most of the time people are selling the speaker is because it's either damaged or doesn't sound good.
Oh
Because if
yeah,
they
exactly.
bought a speaker and broke it in and it sounds good, they're probably not gonna sell it.
Yeah.
And so it's this conundrum, or you get into vintage speakers and then you get into something that I feel like is maybe missed in a lot of like these reviewing vintage pieces of equipment, but as specific parts like speakers is
Mhm.
that is not like the same thing that it was decades and decades and decades ago.
Mhm.
Like time has changed that object,
Yeah.
you know? And
And then you have to
so,
get into, why are you chasing it because it's better or is it just different? Because there's a lot of things that
yeah,
not necessarily sound better or worse, they're just different, right? So is the vintage formulation actually sound better or is it just because it's a thing of nostalgia and
yeah,
the current ones just sound different, not necessarily worse?
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's hard because those early amps and early guitars and early sounds informed everything about the guitar.
Hmm, right.
And it wasn't that the bassman was revised to make the best version of it, but that was like just the first thing. That was the manual,
Mhm.
for the tubes. And so, yeah, but then that informs our ears to what we decide what guitar should sound like.
Mhm.
And so then it's hard because I think a lot of the times, I mean, the other element is we're searching for, a something that's going to sound good enough to make us play better
Yeah.
or, play differently.
And also
That's
being
a
careful, it's not just your brain telling you that it sounds better compared to what actually is.
well, oh yeah.
Like I know I'm gonna ruffle a lot of feathers, but I am like very different than a lot of tube aficionados, whatever, because I don't think NOS tubes are all that.
Yeah.
I mean, I should take that back. I think a lot of NOS tubes they were built definitely more robustly back in the olden days, but they don't necessarily sound better than current production. Current
Mhm.
production still sounds good. They just I mean, they're not built as robustly as I mean, this is one of my things where like you if you're in a tube rolling, you're going to find a good sounding tube that works magically with your amp only because you tried like 50 tubes and you found that one that magically. Now, the fact that it happened to be an NOS tube, yeah, maybe it's just coincidence. Maybe it is actually better. Um, but you know, how much time did that take away from you actually playing guitar, right? So it's like
Right.
right or writing music or doing things that actually uh, you could act, people can actually hear a difference. So like I don't really bother with NOS tubes anymore, even though I have a decent collection. I always come back to the same conclusion where it's just like NOS tubes, you may be able to find one that magically works, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's because it was an NOS tube. It could just because you found a tube that just the characteristic of that tube just works really well with the amp you have. Um,
Yeah.
and you
Well,
could have
and
found
it's
that with new production. I Having said that, there are some new productions that I think are kind of junky, but um, I just don't bother with all that tube sniffing. I mean, I try new production, and before I release my amp, I do like test like 50 different tubes and all new production stuff to see which one works best according to my ears. But then again, at some point I have to draw a line, just say, okay, you gotta stop because Colin's gonna pick this up and be like, I totally disagree with you. I think this tube would have sounded better. And I just wasted all that time for nothing. So yeah, I think I'm gonna ruffle some feathers, but I
I think
I
that's all
think
right.
I think that yeah, there's a point where you the belief that something is better often blinds people to just being more unbiased about things. And I think tubes is kind of a good example of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like
And
there's
speakers too, to some point.
yeah, I mean, there's buying with your eyes, um, and not your ears, but then there's also like deciding what sounds better with the dollars that you spend,
Yeah.
you know. Uh, Yeah, the more unbiased you can be, I think is a quicker way to maybe find what you're looking for. But I don't know. There's also there for some reason there's not a guitar player that doesn't have like a strong opinion about something.
Hmm,
And that
yeah.
kind of makes it I don't know, that's just part of it, like
Yeah,
that's
it kinda makes it fun.
yeah, it does.
Fun and
It
frustrating, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it makes it fun, frustrating, but it's part, that's the human nature part of it.
Yeah.
Like and why we don't even going back to what you said before, like if you play through a hi-fi that actually is the purest sound, like when you're talking about
Yeah,
transparent or organic, like what do you really mean? Because the most transparent and the most organic sound
yeah.
is
It's pretty awful for guitar, yeah.
yeah, it's tough. Tough to listen to and tougher to play.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's all
exactly.
subjective.
Right. That's why, like, I'm like that way with pedals. It's like, I'm just looking for something to fuck up my signal.
Yeah,
That's really it.
yeah,
Um, I mean, I wanna support the companies with people I really like. That's about it. But, yeah, I don't know. I think we all have something, like, stupid that we hold on to.
yeah,
Um, I don't know if you have one you wanna share, but, I'm sure I
yeah.
have a few.
I I feel like I don't know. I'm sure I do. Imma have to think about that. I I think that, like, I definitely fall into like, if we're talking just totally broadly, that, like, thicker guitar necks, like, the beefier, fatter baseball bat that it can be, sounds better and feels better, but that's such a preference. But, like, my hands cramp if I play a thin little neck. It
Yeah, well,
just
I'm in complete agreement with you, so that's not unbiased, that's completely true.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like just the bigger the neck I can get possible. I have this Gibson L50 from 1938,
Oh,
and
nice.
it must have been a Friday, and they shaved as little bit off the neck as passable, and then called it done, which is amazing because some of those are like
Mhm.
V-shaped necks, like it's like you're grabbing the edge of a table. They're so thin.
Yeah.
But this
Yeah.
one is just like the beefiest, roundest, um, barely. I mean, it's just enough to where there is a curve to it,
Hmm.
but it's just a huge chunk of wood. But it feels great, and I think it's also part of like why that guitar is still fully functional in
Yeah.
its regular use. 80 plus years later.
Yeah. Well, after making a lot of guitars and testing a lot of guitars, I am in complete agreement. I think all things being equal, because every piece of wood's different.
Yeah,
So you could find a thin one that works just as well as a thick one. So exceptions aside, in general, I think the physics behind it is sound because a thicker one would support the fundamental note a little bit more solidly than a thinner neck, and that's physics. I mean, it can't get around that. Of course,
yeah,
you can find species and examples of wood that would do that at a much thinner, um, be able to do that and be thinner. But majority, yeah, I prefer the sound of thicker necks. I like the feel, and one of the things I always try to dispel people because I make really all my guitars are really thick neck, but they don't play like they do. Because
hmm,
one of the things about it's not the actual thickness; it's the curve of it, and if it gets away, if it gets out of the way of your knuckles.
yeah,
So like I always carve my necks in a not a V shape, but maybe a hybrid UV shape, because it gets way out of these knuckles right here, and if it's out of that way, everyone says it feels thinner than it is. Yeah, that's a real thing. So I don't, yeah, I wouldn't count that as one of your bias things that you hold on to. I think that's a real thing.
I see. I had a major one that got just shattered
Oh yeah,
recently,
this is
and
exciting.
and there are this is probably the most controversial thing for some reason, but it just is. But in college, I went to this music college, and it's where I got this Dr. Z AC30 that was like a prototype for Brad Paisley, and I traded this the best strat I've ever played to his tech for this amp.
Oh nice.
And I thought that was just the coolest, most random thing that happened on Craigslist. And then also, like, this was my dream amp. And there were a couple guys at the school that had early versions of the Axe effects.
Hmm.
And I would always ask them for performances and stuff as we got on stage, like, hey, can I use your amp tonight? I need to check my email. Um, like, and just making fun of like it's a computer, it's not an amp. And now I have an
Yeah.
Axe FX, and it's not only just like I've played a ton of Kempers because that's just like it's hard to go somewhere and there's not a
Mhm.
Kemper if you're
Yeah.
playing live and doing backline and anyways. And it's the there is this misunderstanding that I think is still the misunderstanding, which is, oh, that's digital and that doesn't sound anything like an amp. And so therefore it sounds bad.
Hmm.
And I think that just most people like you gotta most people compare it incorrectly. You're
Mhm.
right, playing through a Kemper or an Axe FX or something doesn't sound like plugging into your amp. But what it does sound like is an amp in an isolated cab room with mics on it
Mhm.
coming through your speakers, which is what its purpose is for.
Right.
It does sound like that. Um, and I think maybe we've reached a point more recently um, where the physical thing has now been dwindled down to such a small like the feeling of playing through some of the early modelers was terrible. Like it fit the
Mhm.
that feedback loop was very stale.
Yes, I think That's a
And
good one.
that isn't true for me at least anymore. Like, and I think that there are physical, like, major changes that have happened,
Mhm.
in just what we can do nowadays that I think have, at least for me, and maybe everybody's threshold for that is different. But for me, it's like, oh, well, that cannot be discounted anymore. So that was my biggest thing, is that I always was like, no, I'm big, huge pedal board and a big old tube amp, like, and there's nothing that could ever even come close to the same experience. But I don't think that that's true anymore.
Hmm.
And I love both and use both, and where for travel things, like I have an Axe-Fx that's in a pedal board size thing, like a small pedal board,
Mhm.
and it's everything. It's everything.
Yeah.
It's every pedal, it's the amp, it's the cab, it's the mics, I mean, it's a rack.
Yeah.
And there's no getting around how much money that saves, how much time that saves
Oh, yeah.
for
Convenience factor.
traveling. But I'll never get rid of the amps, because they're, one, to I have to remind myself of what it feels like to play in front of an amp sometimes, and how that's where so much more inspiration happens. But
Mhm.
also, at the end of the day, if I had to take what is, I think, the most reliable, would be my smaller pedal board into a tube amp. And I just trust that. And that is, so I think they serve different roles. Um, but that's the biggest one that I had that just totally got demolished for me in the last year.
Yeah. That's a good one. I'm in complete agreement. I think if you look at it from, like, what are they made for
Uh-huh.
and use it as such, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Like, my most played amp is, is not the Quantum Zen or the Polaris. It's actually I have it right here. This little Yamaha practice amp. It's a
Oh,
modeling
yeah.
amp. Only because the time where I can find time to play is usually when, like, the kid is asleep, and neighbor, it's past 10. I have neighbors. I live in the city. It's like I can't crank the thing, so
Yeah.
I play through that, and it sounds good, and it makes me love my tube amps more.
Yeah.
Because when I do plug in a tube amp, it's like, whoa, this is what glorious sounds like, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm just doing scratch demos, or sorry, or just getting ideas down or whatever, I plug into that thing just because I don't have to blast it. I usually, most of my ideas come at late at night. And I just use that to record, or I mean, not record, but just on my phone, just like record some ideas or songs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'm using it for what it was designed for. Am I going to take that on stage and gig? No way.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I get what you're saying. That convenience factor is huge. Just the Kemper and the Axe effects. Those things are pretty cool. I'm not there yet, mainly because, to counter that whole convenience factor, I think I've completely gone into a guitar plug into the amp thingy. Um, I cut out my pedal board first before I go to digital world. Sorry, but yeah, I no, I still have a good, nice size pedal board, but I use that more for inspiration. And um, I've lately been digging that tone of plugging a guitar straight into an amp, just because. So what I do is kind of weird. I actually use my pedal board and to come up with new ideas and new songs. And then when it's time to, like, actually put down the song on tape, that's an old term, by the way. It's actually digitally recorded.
Yeah.
Um, I'll see if I can figure out how to get that same kind of feel plugging straight into an amp. And it doesn't have to be the same, like, notes or whatever. It's completely different, but I try to get the same feel. I think part of that is just because that's how I force myself to be creative,
Mhm.
because I think limitations is actually the spark of creativity,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And so I purposely limit myself by saying, okay, well, how can I do the same feel with no pedal board? And then it forces me to come up with something unique. And, then I think about, like, my favorite tones have always been, like, very little or to almost no effects, like people plugging straight into the amp. Like the old blues players from the 50s. There's no pedals back then. And then
Yeah.
not like I want to play like them at all, but then there's like songs that I remember like where I love the guitar. It's always been like a very raw, no effects and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
also it records easier because the moment you slap on reverbs and delays and stuff like that, it's so easy for it to just get lost in the mix. It pops a little bit more out. And I like my guitar playing to kind of pop out more. So, but yeah, I don't, I have a similar thing with my thing is, I hate it when digital tries to emulate analog. So maybe that's why I don't
Yeah, I think there
like,
is.
delays, for example. My favorite effects are delays. I love
Yeah.
it when digital delays are trying to be weird and digitally do things that analog can't do. I hate it when I don't hate. Hate's a strong word. I prefer not to have a digital pedal emulate an analog
Yeah.
pedal. I feel like I can always hear the difference. I mean, I've done not blind tests on myself, but there's been moments where I had no idea it was digital. And I always been like, yeah, something about this is just off. And then I realized it was digital. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh, that's maybe why. And it happens more than once, like 100 times or more. Um,
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think that there is, well, when you're talking about modelers, there's specifically an inherent 4K
yeah.
something where the
Resolution.
harmonics are unfamiliar.
Yeah.
I don't think that that means that it's, I don't know why that is, but what I do know is the way you use any modeler is to have a 4K pointed cut.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that takes that element of it away. But I totally agree with you with, like, especially pedals. When, like, one of my favorite and most used overdrive pedals is a digital overdrive pedal,
Oh,
but
nice.
it's not trying to be anything.
Yeah.
It is a very utilitarian, can cover a lot of ground, but that's where I think something like that can be optimized. I think it's more optimized when you can have like a, what only a few years ago would be considered a supercomputer
Hmm.
inside an Axe where you're running like full, quality definition plugins.
Yeah.
This is functioning in a different capacity than plugging into a pedal. But I think more importantly, it's like what you said is limitations is actually what sparks creativity. Because the
Yeah.
thing with the Axe is I have you have I mean, I have almost every sound,
Hmm. It's a lot to
and
handle. Yeah.
it's they're all fucking great. Like, I
Mhm.
don't want them to be, but they are.
Right.
And specifically with the Axe effects, like, there is y for a super nerd like me, unlike the rest of them, it is the most, like, you can tweak every tiny parameter, um, and there are some physical changes, like input impedance and
Hmm.
active response in that way, but that's not inspirational and doesn't spark creativity in any way. It's the limitations. I mean, I as a professional songwriter, it's like you show up and you know you're going to write a song at 3 p.m. today.
Yeah.
It's not this like moon and the sun were aligned in a
Mm.
perfect
Yeah.
something, and then I felt a certain way, and then that led me to write this magical song.
Mhm.
Like, I hate to say most songs are not written that way,
Yeah.
and especially like just in the professional world, like songs go through just a whole life of their own. But that's where that efficiency, like, okay, how can I get to writing the right part, putting the
Mhm.
right lyrics here or whatever, and maximizing that, I think, is where that feedback loop, with the gear, and it's the limitations. It's a deluxe memory man, that is like kind of crackly when you try to get the volume up and you're kind of probably, it's just coloring your sound. Like if you took it out of the circuit, your whole signal chain sounds different. But it's
Right.
like that's the magic though.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
It's
why I
hard
said,
to
like, I look for pedals that fuck up my sound, not
yeah,
not try to be as true as possible or whatever
yeah.
because of that. Yeah. That magic or whatever. But yeah, I mean, if it's your job, you just got to do it. You can't wait for the perfect moment. And I think that, yeah, that's exactly how, I mean, if we were all waiting for the perfect moment, nothing would get done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the hard thing. I mean, especially with like practicing. Like
Oh, yeah.
I've been very guilty of like waiting for that day that is just imaginary that I go, I've got an hour of free time. What should I do with this time?
Right.
It'd be great is if I did some learning on guitar. Like that time and that feeling will never come.
Yeah.
But if I schedule like, hey, I need to make sure my chops are up and I
Right.
have specific goals of things that I'm working on, and I put it on the calendar, then it'll happen.
Yeah. I like
Um,
that.
but
Yes.
it's hard to like wait for like an emotional thing to trigger like actions
Hmm.
because it's tough to rely on. I haven't found that it almost ever works, but but
Yeah. I'm with you there. Same way. You just got to schedule it and just do it.
yeah.
It's called adulting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, that's part of it.
Well,
But
cool. Hopefully, got you a lot of material to work with. Hopefully,
yeah,
not too
man,
much.
absolutely. No, yeah. This was really fun. This is good. I mean, this is my I don't know. I couldn't think of a better thing to do on a Tuesday afternoon is than talk about gear and
Oh,
like this
yeah.
is like I said, like it's a lot to have in common with somebody and it's my favorite thing to do is talk to like-minded people and you know I don't know.
Sweet.
Even the disagreements, that happen online that I'm never a part of, but happen in the comment section.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It's the human part of it.
Yeah.
Um, but that's what's fun. Like, there's
Right.
a lot worse things to be staying up at night thinking about than like if a JMP, how to get that exact sound of the JMP cranked with the mid range and
Yeah. Right.
like,
Or do new Celestial blues sound as good as the old ones? Or yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Or
But
tone woods don't matter. I hate that one. That one does bug me though.
yeah,
I have a thing where it's like, just because you don't hear it doesn't mean other people can't hear it.
yeah,
Because just like some people are colorblind to a color, some people don't have. I mean,
yeah,
this is the other thing I learned from the audiologist when I was a kid is not everyone has the same hearing acuity. Some people have more hearing resolution than others. And if you're one of those people who's like can't hear a difference between tone woods, maybe you're lucky. You can buy the cheapest thing and be happy.
yeah.
I'm not one of those, so I'm not lucky in that way, but I'm glad I can hear it.
No, yeah, yeah, that's something that really gets me on the, like, deep questioning reality thing is like
Yeah, it's like, really? You can't hear? Like, we just switch bodies? I mean, there's videos where they switch like just the bodies or whatever, and you can hear a difference.
yeah,
Yeah, maybe it's not as big on YouTube, but like in person, it's huge.
there's nothing that proves anything other than the material matters, and it
Yeah.
might be a small degree. That's maybe up for debate, but the people that
Uh,
are like, "It
I
just
mean,
could never matter,"
right.
it's
So I mean,
just
like,
so, like, stick your head in sand and then flip everybody
yes,
off. Like,
exact. That's what it is. I mean, because I mean, I have lab equipment here that I can show a difference. Like
Yeah.
I'll take a guitar, plug a string, put it through the equipment that the frequency analyzer, and I'll like I don't know, for some shits and giggles, I took like a bolt or something or hammer or whatever. I just glued on a different piece of wood, and you can see the differences, right? Just
Yeah.
like a different screw. Like I changed the screws in a bridge. I didn't for some reason the stainless steel, and I was trying, I was being crazy. This is crazy, by the way. This is stupid. But I was like, I was convinced a stainless steel affected the tone somehow. So I changed the stainless steel bolts to just plain old nickel coated steel screws, and yeah, you could see the little frequency, the whatever. It was a little different, overlay one over the other. You could see a little spikes in different places, and it's like it's there. The difference is there. Whether you can hear it or not, yeah, that's up for debate. And maybe for those people who are like, yeah, tone word doesn't matter, they really can't hear it. And that's fine. Just understand that the way you see the world is the way you see the world, not what everyone else sees the world. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the part that annoys me the most is this um mentality that the way I see the world is the way to see the world. Or
Yeah.
in this case, hear the world. Right? And it's just like, no, you just completely discounted everyone else's differences and experiences and whatever. But yeah, I think that's the part that bugs me. It's just that kind of attitude.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
That might be
whatever.
a fundamentally flawed thing just across the board.
Oh yeah.
But
Yeah, exactly.
but
Well, cool.
anyways, here we
Yeah.
are, and we love music and we love guitar amps, and
Yeah.
after we talked ourselves down a hole there.
Yeah. Right. No, sorry.
No, it's not
Yeah.
your fault. But
Yeah, for those people who can hear a difference, I'll continue to make the good stuff for you. So
yeah, there we go. Well, man, I'm
sweet.
I'm excited to have the amp here, and thanks again for doing this interview. I think it's
No,
gonna be a good
anytime.
one.
This
So
was fun. And
yeah,
thanks for doing the interview. It's awesome. I don't always any chance to get talk with gear with cool
yeah,
folk. It's always fun.
yeah. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
So well,
Sweet.
awesome, man. I'll talk to you soon. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and everything.
Sweet. I'm getting back to work on your amp, so
Awesome.
don't keep me up or holding me back. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Yeah,
And thanks, Colin. I really appreciate it.
yeah. Eddie, is so good to catch up and see
Good
you
luck
again.
editing
And
this video. I feel like there's a lot of stuff in there.
yeah, yeah. There's plenty
Okay.
for sure,
Sweet.
but it'll be good. So I'll let you know when it's all up and everything.
Great. All 3 hours. Great.
Yep. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to support me, you can become a Shredder level member of this channel. Make sure you're subscribed, share this channel with others. There's affiliate links down in the description below, as well as a merch store. And until next time, I've been Colin.